The city streets were quieter than usual that night. A thin mist drifted through the air, curling around the base of the tall steel buildings. Most shops had closed hours ago, and the only sounds were the hum of distant transport shuttles and the faint chatter from a few open diners. Evan walked slowly down the narrow sidewalk, his boots making soft thuds on the worn pavement. He had just finished a long day of cargo runs between the human colony and nearby settlements, and his shoulders still ached from lifting heavy crates. In his right hand, he carried a small paper bag from the diner he had stopped at before heading back to his freighter. Inside the bag was what remained of his dinner, half a sandwich and a portion of warm potato wedges. He had eaten enough to be satisfied, but didn't want to waste the rest. Normally, he would store it on his ship for later, but tonight he had decided to walk for a bit before heading back. Something about the misty streets felt calming. As he passed an alley between two buildings, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, but when he turned his head, he saw a small figure sitting against the wall in the shadows. The figure was still, knees pulled tightly to their chest, head lowered. Evan slowed his steps. The dim light from a nearby street lamp barely reached the alley, but he could make out the outline of thin arms and legs. Whoever it was, they were. Very small, child-sized. He took a step closer, peering into the darkness. The figure looked up suddenly, and his breath caught. It wasn't a human child. Her skin was a pale lavender, almost silver in the faint light. Her large eyes reflected the glow of the street lamp, and her face was narrow, with delicate features that looked almost fragile. She wore a shirt that was much too big for her, the sleeves hanging loose, and her pants were frayed at the edges. Her bare feet were pressed flat against the cold pavement. She didn't speak, but her gaze dropped quickly to the paper bag in his hand. Evan froze for a moment, unsure what to do. The girl's eyes stayed fixed on the bag, and in that moment, he realized she was hungry. Not just mildly hungry, but desperately so. He could see the way her thin frame trembled, and how her lips pressed together as if she was trying not to ask for what she needed. He stepped a little closer, careful not to startle her. "Hey," he said gently, his voice calm. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked up to meet his for a second, then back down to the bag again. Evan looked at the alley's cracked walls and the faint water dripping from a leaky pipe. No blanket, no belongings, nothing to suggest she had a home, just a small alien girl sitting in the cold. He crouched down slowly, bringing himself closer to her level. "It's just food," he said, holding the bag out a little. "Still warm." She hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes, fear, mistrust, but also the pull of hunger. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her hands moved cautiously, fingers thin and slightly trembling as she reached forward. She took the bag quickly, then leaned back again, creating space between them. For a brief moment, her eyes met his again, almost as if she was silently checking whether he would try to take it back. When he didn't move, she opened the bag and pulled out the sandwich first. She didn't bother unwrapping it completely before taking a large bite. Her jaw moved fast, chewing with urgency, as if afraid the food might disappear if she didn't eat it quickly enough. Evan stayed crouched, watching quietly. He didn't want to make her feel cornered, but something about the sight made his chest tighten. This was a human colony on a distant world, full of trade and resources. Yet here was a child sitting in an alley, starving. She finished half the sandwich, in seconds, then looked at the potato wedges. Her thin fingers picked one up and she popped it into her mouth. Her eyes closed for a second, as if savoring the taste. Evan's mind began to fill with questions. Where were her parents? Was she lost? Had she been abandoned? But looking at her now, he knew pressing for answers would only make her more guarded. Instead, he asked something simple. Do you have somewhere to go?" The girl shook her head slightly without looking up. "Family?" No answer. She kept eating, her small shoulders hunching as though she was trying to make herself smaller. Evan sighed. He wanted to help, but he also knew he was just a pilot passing through. His freighter wasn't exactly a place for a child, and he had no authority in the city to take her anywhere official. Even so, the thought of leaving her here didn't sit right with him. When she finished the food, she carefully folded the empty bag and set it beside her. Then, without warning, she stood up. For a moment, Evan thought she might say something, but she only gave a quick glance in his direction before stepping back deeper into the shadows. "Wait!" He started, but she was already moving. Her bare feet made no sound as she slipped between the buildings, vanishing into the maze of alleys beyond. Evan stood there for a long moment, staring after her. The mist had grown thicker, making the alley seem even emptier now. He finally exhaled, shaking his head. Back on his ship later that night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her hands had trembled when she took the food, the way she had eaten so fast, and those eyes, large, cautious, but still holding a trace of hope. He told himself there was nothing more he could have done, but deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. His schedule for the day was light, just one short cargo run to a nearby settlement. Yet even as he worked, his mind kept drifting back to that alley. By the time evening came, Evan found himself walking the same route as before, passing the same diners, scanning the same shadows. The paper bag in his hand tonight held an extra meal he had ordered just in case. But the alley was empty. He stood there for a while, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Maybe she had found help. Maybe she had gone somewhere safer. Still, as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that their brief meeting wasn't over. That night, he sat in the small living quarters of his freighter, watching the stars through the viewport. The hum of the ship's systems was steady and familiar, but his thoughts were unsettled. Evan had traveled across dozens of worlds, met traders, miners, settlers, and countless alien species. But he couldn't remember the last time a stranger's situation had stayed with him this way. Somewhere in the city, that small alien girl was trying to survive another night. And whether he admitted it or not, part of him hoped he'd see her again. He didn't know it yet, but fate was already arranging. That second meeting. The city had the same misty air the next evening, but Evan noticed more movement than usual around the docks. Cargo crews hurried between freighters, loading crates and checking manifests. Street vendors called out their deals for the night shift workers. The faint hum of shuttle engines vibrated in the ground. Evan had finished unloading his small freighter earlier than expected. He thought about going straight to his quarters, but his stomach argued otherwise. The diner from the night before wasn't far, and he still liked the idea of a warm meal before ending the day. As he walked toward it, he caught himself glancing at the same alley where he had first seen the lavender-skinned girl. The shadows were empty and the cracked wall looked exactly the same. Only the faint dripping of that leaky pipe broke the silence. He sighed and kept going. Inside the diner, the air smelled of grilled vegetables and fresh bread. A few miners in dusty uniforms sat at the counter, and a couple of alien traders occupied a corner booth, their voices low. Evan took his usual spot by the window, ordered stew and bread, and ate slowly. He didn't expect anything unusual that night. But when he stepped outside again, his pace slowed almost instantly. There she was, the same small alien girl, standing under the dim glow of the street lamp across from the diner. She wasn't in the shadows this time. Her bare feet were still visible, and her clothes still hung loosely on her thin frame, but there was a difference. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a taller woman, her posture straight despite the weariness in her face. She was clearly the girl's mother. Her skin had the same pale lavender tone, but her eyes were sharper, scanning the street like someone who had learned not to trust easily. She held her daughter close with one hand, her other hand gripping the strap of a worn bag slung over her shoulder. The little girl saw Evan first. Her eyes lit up with recognition, and she tugged gently on her mother's hand. The woman followed her daughter's gesture, her gaze meeting Evan's. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other. Him, a tired human pilot with a work jacket. Over his shoulders, her, a stranger whose guarded expression softened just slightly. They stepped closer. The girl stayed half hidden behind her mother's side, but Evan could still see her peeking out. "You fed my child," the woman said in broken but clear human language. Her voice was low, careful. "She told me." Evan nodded. "Yeah, she looked hungry." The woman's eyes dropped briefly to the ground before meeting his again. "We have no home," she said slowly, choosing her words. "No safe place. Can we stay?" Evan felt his chest tighten. He had been ready for the girl to maybe thank him or even just wave. But this, asking to stay, on his ship? He glanced toward the docking bay where his freighter sat in its assigned berth. It was small, only 2 sleeping bunks, a narrow kitchen, and a cramped cargo hold. Barely enough space for one person to live comfortably, let alone 3. He hesitated. "I'm just a cargo pilot," he said carefully. "I don't have much space." The woman's expression didn't change, but the way she held her daughter told him enough. This wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. Evan looked down at the little girl. She was still watching him with those large, cautious eyes. He remembered how she had eaten that sandwich so quickly, how her hands had trembled when she took the bag. "What's your name?" he asked the woman. "Sayela," she replied. She placed a hand on her daughter's head. "This is Rin." Evan gave a slow nod. "All right, Sayla, Rin, you can come to the ship for the night. Just one night," he added quickly, more to reassure himself than to limit them. Sayla didn't smile, but she gave a small, respectful nod. "Thank you." The walk to the docking bay was quiet. Sayla kept Rin close to her side, her eyes always scanning their surroundings. Rin clutched the strap of her mother's bag, stealing glances at Evan now and then. When they reached the freighter, Evan keyed in the access code. The door hissed open, and the faint scent of machine oil and recycled air drifted out. Inside, the ship was tidy but clearly lived in. A small table was bolted to the floor near the kitchenette, and 2 narrow bunks were built into the wall across. From the control room entrance, the cargo hold door was sealed. "You can take that bunk," Evan said, pointing to the lower one. "There's a blanket and pillow already there." Sayela guided Rin toward it. The girl sat down, running her hands over the blanket as if testing whether it was real. "I have stew left from earlier," Evan offered. "It's not much, but it's warm." Sayela hesitated, then nodded. "We will share." Evan served the stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. Rin climbed onto the seat first, her legs swinging above the floor. She waited for her mother to take the first bite before eating. They ate slowly, almost as if savoring each spoonful. Evan didn't pry into their situation. He figured if they wanted to talk, they would. After the meal, Sayela spoke. "We came from a village far from here. The land was good. We grew food, traded with neighbors." Her voice tightened slightly. "Then the miners came. They said they owned the ground now. We had no papers. We left." Evan listened quietly. He had heard similar stories on other worlds, corporate land seizures disguised as resource management. For people without official records, it was almost impossible to fight back. In the city, Sayla continued, "I take work when I can. Many times, no pay, only promise of food, but..." She shook her head. It is not safe for Rin. Too many disappear. Evan understood. On colony worlds like this, the lower districts could be dangerous, especially for those without protection. You were kind, Sila said finally, meeting his eyes. Kind to feed her. Many walked past. You stopped. Evan shifted in his seat. I couldn't just ignore her. Sila gave the smallest nod. That is why we ask. Just until we find safe ground. Evan leaned back, running a hand over his face. He had no real plan for this. His work kept him moving between settlements. Keeping them aboard meant sharing limited space, stretching supplies, and possibly attracting the wrong kind of attention. But looking at Rin, now curled up on the bunk with the blanket around her shoulders, he knew what he was going to say before he even spoke. You can stay for a few days, he said finally. But we'll need to figure something out after that. For the first time, Siela's expression softened. Thank you, Evan. That night, Evan lay in his bunk above theirs, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the ship's life support systems was steady, but his thoughts were restless. He had seen hardship before, miners injured on the job, settlers forced to leave their homes, traders swindled out of their earnings. But something about Siela and Rin's situation felt different. It wasn't just bad luck, it was targeted, deliberate, and that meant danger. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were meant to cross. Morning came quietly. Evan brewed a pot of strong coffee, while Siela prepared a small breakfast from the supplies he had. She moved carefully, though she didn't want to overstep, but she made sure Rin had the largest portion. After breakfast, Evan headed to the control room to check the day's cargo schedule. There were no assignments yet, unusual for the dock manager, who usually had shipments ready by dawn. He figured he'd have time to help Siela and Rin settle in better. But when he stepped out of the ship to stretch his legs, he noticed two men lingering near the far side of the docking bay. They weren't in dock worker uniforms. One wore a clean corporate security jacket, the other a plain coat that didn't quite hide the weapon at his side. They were scanning the ships one by one, asking questions to nearby workers. Evan's stomach sank. He walked back inside quickly, sealing the door behind him. Sila looked up from the table, sensing his tension. What is it? She asked quietly. There are people asking around, Evan said. Not dock workers. Corporate. Siela's face went pale. She reached instinctively for Rin, pulling her close. They are looking for us, she said, her voice low and certain. Evan didn't ask how she knew. The fear in her eyes told him everything, and in that moment, he realized letting them stay wasn't just an act of kindness anymore. It was a choice that might put them all in danger. The freighter's cabin felt smaller than usual that morning. Evan could sense the tension in the air. Siela sat at the table with her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the floor. Rin sat beside her, chewing on a small piece of bread, her legs swinging restlessly. Outside, through the small viewport, the docking bay was busy with the usual noise of freight loaders and ship repairs. But Evan knew that somewhere among the crowd, there were men searching. Men who had no interest in helping, only in catching. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. If those corporate guys are looking for you, we can't stay here too long, he said quietly. Siela lifted her gaze. I know. They will not stop. They want to silence me. Evan studied her. You said last night you left your village. Because of mining companies, is that why they're after you? She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. When they took our land, they forced many to work in their camps. I was one of them. They promised food and shelter, but it was lies. They worked people until they were sick. Some never came back. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened as she spoke. One night I heard two men speaking in the storage tent. They said the company was hiding the deaths, hiding how dangerous the work was. I remembered their words, and I left. Evan didn't need to hear more to understand. In corporate-controlled colonies, information like that was dangerous. If she talked, they could face heavy penalties or lose their control over the land, and that meant they'd make sure she never got the chance to speak. He exhaled slowly. All right, then staying hidden is the priority. Rin looked up from her bread. Will they come here? She asked softly. Evan crouched down to her level. Not if I can help it, but we have to be careful. The girl nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. The next 2 days passed in a careful routine. Evan avoided the busier docks, only going out to pick up supplies when absolutely necessary. Saela stayed on the ship with Rin, keeping her occupied with small games and teaching her numbers in their native language. Evan noticed that Rin's laughter was starting to return, at least in small bursts. The first time he heard it, it caught him off guard. It was light and bright, a sound that didn't belong to someone who had been living in fear. One evening, he returned from a supply run to find the ship smelling faintly of spices. Saela had cooked something from the small stores she carried in her worn bag. The dish was simple, flatbread and a stew made from dried vegetables, but it was rich with unfamiliar flavors. You didn't have to do this, Evan said, setting down the small crate of spare parts he'd brought. You gave us food, Saela replied. We share what we can. They ate together, and for a brief moment, the freighter felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. But the quiet didn't last. On the third morning, Evan was checking the ship's exterior panels when a shadow fell across the hull. He looked up to see a man in a plain jacket standing a few meters away, pretending to inspect a docking clamp. His stance was too stiff, too deliberate, like someone trying to look casual but failing. Evan didn't say anything, but he made a mental note. When he went inside, Saela saw the tension in his face instantly. They're still looking? She asked. Yeah. And they're getting closer, he replied. Saela glanced at Rin, who was sitting cross-legged on the bunk, drawing shapes on a scrap of paper. Her voice dropped. If they find us, they will take me first. She must not be with them. Evan could hear the quiet desperation in her words. Then we make sure they don't find either of you, he said firmly. That afternoon, he began planning possible escape routes. His freighter was fitted for short to mid-range cargo runs, not for long-distance smuggling. If they wanted to disappear completely, he'd have to leave the corporate-controlled zones and head for the outer fringe settlements, places where laws were loose and questions were few. But leaving wasn't simple. The moment a ship departed, without proper clearance, docking control would log it. If corporate security had marked his ship, they'd know the instant he took off. He was still considering options when Rin wandered into the control room. She climbed onto the co-pilot seat, her small feet dangling far above the floor. What are you doing? She asked. Trying to figure out where we can go without getting caught, he said with a faint smile. She tilted her head, watching the blinking lights on the navigation console. Can't we just go fast? Evan chuckled softly. That's one way, but if we just go fast, they'll know where we went. We have to be smarter than that. Rin leaned closer, pointing to a section of the map where the routes crisscrossed, in a mess of lines. What about here? Evan looked. It was an old trade sector with abandoned routes from decades ago. Most freighters avoided it because the navigation beacons had fallen into disrepair, making travel riskier. But for someone trying to disappear, it wasn't a bad idea. You might be onto something, kid, he said. That night, over a simple dinner, Evan brought up the plan. There's an old route through abandoned sectors. Risky, but it might keep us off their scanners. Saela listened carefully. How far? About 4 days' travel. There's a settlement called Haven Reach on the other side. Independent. They don't report to corporate. Saela's eyes narrowed slightly. Safe? As safe as anywhere can be, Evan replied honestly. But if we go, we have to leave soon. They're closing in. She looked at Rin, who was quietly eating her bread, then back at Evan. Then we go. The next morning was filled with quiet preparation. Evan checked the engines twice, made sure the fuel cells were full, and stocked as much food and water as the small ship could carry. Scylla gathered her few belongings into a small pack. Rin clutched a small piece of cloth with faded stitching, probably the only keepsake from home she had left. Before they could finish, Evan's comm system buzzed with a short-range transmission. Docking control to Freighter 742. Report to Bay Office for inspection. Evan's stomach tightened. An inspection could be routine, but with the men searching the docks, it could also be the beginning of trouble. He moved quickly to the cabin. We're leaving now. Scylla's eyes widened. Now. Now, he repeated. Before they... Get here! Within minutes, the freighter's engines roared to life. Evan sent a quick departure code to docking control, disguising it as a scheduled cargo run to a nearby settlement. He eased the ship out of the berth, keeping his movements steady to avoid suspicion. The city lights fell away behind them, replaced by the endless dark of space. Rin sat by the viewport, watching the stars slide past. For a moment, it felt like they might have pulled it off. But then the proximity alarm began to beep. Evan checked the screen. A small vessel had broken from the docks, its trajectory matching. They're following, he said under his breath. Scylla moved to stand behind him. Can we lose them? Evan's hands moved quickly over the controls. If we reach that abandoned trade sector before they catch up, maybe. He pushed. The engines harder, the hum in the cabin growing louder. The pursuing ship kept closing the distance. Hold on, he called out. The freighter banked sharply, diving toward a debris field left from an old mining operation. Large chunks of rock and twisted metal drifted slowly, forming a dangerous maze. The pursuing ship hesitated at the edge, its pilot unsure about following through such hazardous territory. Evan used the moment to slip between the drifting obstacles, weaving through narrow gaps until the scanner no longer showed pursuit. Only. When they were clear did he ease the engines back. Rin let out a breath she'd been holding. Did we make it? For now, Evan said. Scylla placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you. Evan didn't answer right away. He was still watching the stars ahead, knowing that this was only the beginning. Haven Reach was still days away, and they would have to stay hidden the whole way there. But as he glanced at Scylla and Rin, he knew he was committed. Whatever it took, he would get them to safety. The freighter drifted in the quiet darkness of space. Outside the windows, stars shone like cold, distant fires. The hum of the engines was steady now, no longer straining after their sharp escape through the debris field. Evan sat in the pilot's chair, eyes scanning the navigation screen. The route ahead led into the abandoned trade sector, uncharted for years, with broken navigation beacons and drifting hazards. The ship's autopilot couldn't be trusted here. Every turn would have to be flown by hand. Behind him, Scylla sat, at the small table, mending a tear in Rin's oversized shirt with thin thread from her pack. The girl was curled up on the bunk, holding her small cloth keepsake and whispering quietly in her native language. Evan broke the silence. We'll be in the unmonitored zone within a few hours. Once we're deep enough, they won't be able to track us easily. Scylla didn't look up from her sewing. And if they do? Then we make sure they regret trying, he said, but his voice was calm, not reckless. She glanced at him then, her eyes studying his face as though trying to measure how far he was willing to go for two strangers he barely knew. 3 hours later, the freighter crossed into the abandoned sector. The change was immediate. Navigation beacons no longer blinked in the distance, and the darkness seemed deeper. Vast shapes floated through the void. Shattered cargo hulls, the skeletal remains of stations, and clouds of debris from long-forgotten skirmishes. Evan slowed their speed, weaving the ship carefully around jagged fragments of metal. "This is why no one uses this route anymore," he said over his shoulder. "One wrong move and the hull's done for." Rin climbed into the co-pilot seat, eyes wide as she looked out. "It's like a graveyard," she whispered. "Pretty." "Much," Evan replied. For several hours they moved in silence. Occasionally, a faint metallic ping would echo through the hull as a small piece of debris brushed against them. Scylla kept watch from the side viewport, scanning for anything that looked like more than drifting scrap. By the second day in the sector, they were starting to relax again. There was no sign of pursuit, and the navigation map showed they were halfway through. If all went well, they'd be at Haven Reach in just 2 more days, but safety never lasts long. It began with a faint blip on the scanner, small, slow-moving, but closing the distance. Evan frowned, tapping the screen. "We've got company." Scylla stood, moving to his side. "Corporate?" He shook his head. "Too small for a patrol ship. Could be a scavenger or a raider." Rin looked between them, sensing the tension. "Is that bad?" "It could be," Evan admitted. "Depends on what they want." He adjusted their course, trying to slip behind a cluster of derelict freighters. The blip on the scanner adjusted with them. Whoever it was, they were definitely following. Sayla's voice was firm. "They will not stop." Evan's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make them." The pursuing ship came into view an hour later, sleek and patched together, clearly built from scavenged parts. It wasn't a corporate vessel, but it had the hungry look of something piloted by people who made a living off others' misfortune. A message crackled through the comm. "Unregistered freighter. Cut engines and prepare to be boarded. We're just here for a search." Evan snorted. "Sure you are." Sayla's eyes narrowed. "If they board, they will take us, or worse." Evan turned to her. "Then we don't let them board." He threw the freighter into a sharp turn, engines flaring as they sped toward a dense cluster of wreckage. The raider ship followed, but Evan knew the terrain better now. He wove through narrow gaps between twisted metal beams, banking hard around a massive section of hull plating. The raider fired a warning shot, plasma bolts sizzling past their left side. Rin gasped and gripped the seat tightly. "Hold on," Evan called. He spotted a gap between 2 large, spinning cargo containers and aimed straight for it. The freighter scraped through with barely a meter to spare. The raider hesitated, adjusting its angle, and in that hesitation, Evan made his move. He gunned the engines, looping behind a drifting station ring. As the raider came around, Evan swung the freighter out and hit the thrusters hard, sending a burst of debris spinning into the raider's path. The smaller ship clipped a piece of metal, spinning slightly before regaining control. By then, Evan had already pushed them deeper into the wreck field. The scanner blinked. No more pursuit. When the silence returned, Rin let out a shaky breath. "We got away?" "For now," Evan said, easing their speed. Scylla placed a hand on Rin's shoulder. "We are safe, little one." But Evan noticed she didn't look entirely convinced. He knew she understood that every day in this sector carried new risks. And so did he. That night, while Scylla and Rin slept, Evan sat alone in the control room, staring at the navigation display. He thought about what would happen if they reached Haven Reach. He could drop them off, make sure they had shelter, then go back to his work. That was the sensible thing to do. But something about that plan felt wrong. He had taken responsibility for them, even if he hadn't meant to. Leaving them to fend for themselves, even in a safer place, didn't sit right in his gut. He realized then that his decision wasn't about cargo runs or lost time anymore. It was about making sure they never had to run again. The next day, the Ubayase sector grew quieter, the debris field thinning as they neared its far edge. Haven Reach was now less than a day away. Rin spent most of the morning in the co-pilot seat, humming softly to herself. Sayala sat across from Evan at the table, looking out the viewport. You could leave us there, she said suddenly, not looking at him. Evan glanced at her. Is that what you want? She hesitated. It is. What makes sense? You have your own life. Maybe, he said. But after everything, I'm not sure I could just fly away. Sayala's eyes met his for a long moment. There was no smile, but something in her expression shifted, a quiet understanding. By late afternoon, the faint lights of Haven Reach appeared ahead, glimmering in the darkness like a cluster of fireflies. The station was built into the remains of a hollowed-out asteroid, with docking bays carved into its surface. It was small, but its independence was its strength. As they approached, a calm voice came over the comm. Unregistered freighter. Identify your purpose. Evan replied smoothly, Cargo pilot seeking temporary docking for resupply. The controller paused, then said, Docking granted. Bay 3. Evan guided the freighter into the bay, landing gently. The engines powered down, leaving a heavy silence in the cabin. Rin pressed her face to the viewport. Is this it? This is it, Evan said. When the hatch opened, the warm, slightly dusty air of the station filled the ship. Haven Reach wasn't fancy, just narrow corridors, old metal plating, and the smell of recycled air. But it was safe. As they stepped out, a tall, middle-aged woman in a mechanic's vest approached. First time here? She asked. Evan nodded. Looking for somewhere quiet. The woman's eyes moved briefly to Sayala and Rin. She didn't ask questions, just gave a short nod. You'll find it here. They were shown to a small living unit, a single room with 2 beds, a table, and a narrow window looking out into the docking bay. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and it was theirs. Rin ran to the window, pressing her hands against it. We can stay here? She asked, turning to her mother. Sayla rested a hand on her daughter's head. Yes, we can stay. Evan stood in the doorway, watching them. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had brought them here, just as he'd promised. But the thought of leaving was harder than he expected. That night, as he prepared to return to his freighter, Rin ran up to him. She hugged him tightly, her small arms barely reaching around his waist. You gave me food, she said softly. But you also gave me my life back. Evan swallowed hard. You take care of each other, all right? Sayala stepped forward. You have done more for us than anyone. If you ever need a place to return to, you will find one here. Evan nodded. I'll remember that. As he walked back to his ship, he knew the journey wasn't truly over. For them, this was a new beginning. And for him, it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest choice, a bag of leftovers, could change the course of lives forever. The morning light in Haven Reach was softer than on most stations. The asteroid's thick rock shielded its residents from the harsh glare of nearby suns, letting the artificial lights mimic a calm sunrise. Evan woke in his small freighter cabin, the hum of the station's dock systems faint in the background. For the first time in weeks, there was no sense of urgency pressing against his chest. No corporate patrols, no shadowing ships, no hurried escape routes, but there was something else pressing against him, something he didn't want to name. A quiet weight, heavy in its own way. He washed up, changed into his work jacket, and made his way through the narrow station corridors toward the unit where Sayala and Rin were staying. When he knocked, the door slid open almost at once. Rin stood there, her hair brushed and her oversized shirt neatly tucked into slightly better-fitting pants. She grinned. "You're here," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The room was simple. 2 beds, a small table, a cooking unit, but Sayala had already made it feel lived in. A woven cloth from her pack covered part of the table, and Rin's drawings were taped to one wall. "You look better," Evan said to Sayala. She nodded. "Sleep helps. And knowing we are not being hunted." Rin tugged at Evan's sleeve. I want to show you something. She led him to the table where a small pile of colored stones sat. I found them in the market. The shopkeeper gave them to me for helping carry a box. Evan smiled. Looks like you're making friends already. Sila gave a small nod. People here, they do not ask too many questions. They help if they can. That's why I brought you here. Evan said, No one will bother you without reason. For the next few days, Evan stayed docked at Haven Reach, running minor cargo for the local merchants. It wasn't much profit, but it gave him an excuse to stay close. Each evening, he would visit Sayela and Rin. Sometimes they would share a meal. Sometimes they would simply sit together, talking about nothing in particular. He learned that Sayela had once been a skilled grower of medicinal plants in her village. Without land, she couldn't practice her craft, but she still carried knowledge in her mind that no corporation could take. Rin, meanwhile, was curious about everything: station layout, ship controls, even the different languages she heard in the market. One evening, as they sat sharing a modest dinner, Sila spoke. We are safe here, but I cannot take only. I must give back. Evan knew what she meant. You'll find a way. People here will notice your skills. Sayela gave him a steady look. And you? Will you stay? He hesitated, looking at the steaming mug in his hands. I don't know yet. My work keeps me moving. That's what I'm used to. Rin's face fell slightly. But you could stay. Evan reached across the table and ruffled her hair. Even if I go, I'll come back. The next morning brought a reminder of why Haven Reach was different from corporate ports. In the central square, traders from different worlds exchanged, goods without security drones hovering over them. Children ran freely through the market paths. Musicians played near the food stalls, their melodies mixing with the scent of baked bread and spiced stew. Evan walked with Sayela and Rin through the crowd. Sayela stopped at a stall selling seed packets and herbs, speaking quietly with the vendor. She returned with a small pouch and a glint of determination in her eyes. I will grow again, she said simply. Evan believed her, but Haven Reach, while safe, was not untouched by the galaxy's troubles. One evening, a merchant Evan knew pulled him aside. Word is, corporate scouts were seen 2 sectors away, the man said. If they find out who you brought here, they might try something. Evan's jaw tightened. They won't get the chance. The merchant shrugged. Just be ready. Haven Reach is independent, but not invincible. That night, Evan sat in his freighter long after the station lights dimmed. He thought about the first night he saw Rin in that alley, pale and silent, too afraid to speak. He thought about Sayela's quiet strength and how she'd risked everything to protect her daughter. He realized then that leaving now would feel like walking away from unfinished work. 2 days later, he knocked on their door. Again, Sayela opened it, her hands lightly dusted with soil from planting herbs in small pots by the window. I've been thinking, Evan began. I have cargo runs that pass near here. I could make Haven Reach my regular stop. Sayela studied him for a moment. That is your choice, but I think Rin would like that. The girl appeared behind her mother, her face brightening. You mean you'll come back lots? More than lots, Evan said with a small grin. Weeks passed. Haven Reach became a rhythm in Evan's life, a place where he knew he was welcome. Between runs, he'd bring small things for Sayela's growing herb garden, a new pot, a rare seed, a better light strip for the window. Rin learned to help in the market, carrying goods and learning trades from the stall owners. Sayela began to earn a small income selling medicinal teas made from her plants. One afternoon, Evan found himself in the market square watching them from a distance. Sayela was speaking with a customer, her hands moving gracefully as she explained the properties of a plant. Rin was laughing with another child, showing off her collection of colored stones. He felt something warm in his chest, a quiet satisfaction, deeper than anything a cargo delivery could give. But the past had a way of testing the present. One evening, as Evan returned from a short run, he noticed a ship docked 2 bays away. Its markings were subtle, but he recognized the corporate crest etched faintly near the tail. He didn't wait. Heading straight for Sayla's unit, he found her at the table, sorting dried leaves. "We might have trouble," he said without preamble. Her eyes darkened. "How close?" 2 bays down. Rin looked between them, sensing the tension. "Do we have to run again?" she asked softly. Evan knelt beside her. "Not if I can help it." That night, he spoke with a few trusted station workers. Haven Reach wasn't under corporate law, but an unwanted visitor could still cause problems. The station master, a broad-shouldered man with a quiet voice, listened carefully. "Your friends have done no harm here," the master said. "If those scouts ask questions, they'll get nothing from us. But we'll keep watch." And they did. The next day, when the corporate crew wandered the market, station guards followed at a distance. Questions were met with shrugs and polite refusals. By evening, the ship had left, empty-handed. When Evan told Sayla, she gave a small nod. "It seems we are not alone anymore." Months later, the story of their arrival had faded into just another thread in the life of Haven Reach. Sayla's. Her business flourished. Rin attended lessons with other children and spoke better human language every week. Evan still traveled, but each return to Haven Reach felt less like a stop and more like coming home. On one such visit, he found Rin, waiting at the dock, her arms crossed in mock impatience. "You took too long," she said. "I brought something to make up for it," he replied, handing her a small pouch of bright stones from a distant mining world. Her eyes lit up, and she dashed off to show her mother. That evening, they sat together, in the small unit, sharing a simple meal. "You've changed this place for us," Sayla said quietly to Evan. "We were running, hiding. Now we are living." Evan looked at her, then at Rin, who was humming to herself as she sorted her new stones. "You've changed things for me too," he admitted. "I didn't know how much I needed somewhere to come back to." The room was warm, the hum of the station outside steady and calm. For the first time since that night in the alley, everything felt settled. As the night deepened, Evan stood to leave for his freighter. Rin hugged him tightly at the door. "Don't be gone too long," she said. "I won't," he promised. Sayla met his gaze and gave a small, steady nod. "Safe travels, Evan." He stepped into the corridor, the air cool and faintly metallic. As he walked back toward the docking bay, he thought about how far they'd all come, from an alley in the shadows to a place where laughter could echo without fear. And he knew that no matter where his runs took him, there would always be a reason to return. Because sometimes a single act of kindness didn't just change one life, it changed 3.